A lot of people think they're growing closer to God, but they're not. Want to find out how to do it well? Well, that's what we're talking about this week on Journey at Home. So last week I jumped us into a conversation about what it means to follow Jesus, and I want to explore that concept a bit more this week. What we learn from Jesus and from the writers of the letters of the New Testament is that following Jesus is primarily a group activity. Jesus commanded His followers to love one another in the same way He loved them, and they wrote about it a lot. They were always defining what this life of loving like Jesus looked like, and it was the primary concern of those early followers. And it should be ours as well, which leads us to this conclusion last week. You can't love one another without doing life with one another. That to follow Jesus and love like He did, we have to be intentional and consistent and committed to a group of people, and we learn together how to love one another. We have to practice honoring others over ourselves, or giving sacrificially to them, encouraging them, serving them, forgiving them, asking forgiveness sometimes. That's the way we learn to love like Jesus did. So we have some relationships that we know about their struggles and their fears and their goals and their dreams, and then they know ours. And out of that kind of relationship comes a proving ground for our faith that's expressed through love. So, go make really good friends. Get vulnerable with them and share all your yucky stuff and let them into your life and give them permission to call you out when you step out of line, and let them know that you're going to do the same. And you're going to support each other, even when it's hard. Piece of cake. Problem solved. And we're all following Jesus, right? I know. I get it. This is one of the most difficult tasks we have facing us as followers of Jesus. Finding that kind of community and that kind of friendship, that kind of trust and commitment. We have a hard enough time finding that in our own marriages or in our families. Why would we expect to find it among the other folks at our church, right? I mean, it seems like an impossible pipe dream, but that's not the way the early followers of Jesus thought about it. It wasn't an unreachable reality. It was a necessary and vital component to getting closer to God. In fact, as you read the writings of guys like John, who is one of Jesus' best friends, you learn that he thinks these kinds of relationships are what help us see God clearly. In his first letter to the church, he says this: "Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen." In other words, loving God and loving others, inseparable. You can't do one without the other. So think about how big this is. Think about how earth-shattering this truth is. I don't think I can oversell this. I'm not exaggerating in the least when I tell you this. I have a tendency to get all excited about some things, but the core of this truth reveals something that we often don't actually admit about what it means to follow God. Here's what John is saying. You can't get closer to God by yourself. I'm not saying that you should stop reading the Bible on your own. I'm not saying prayer is a waste of time. I'm not saying that fasting or solitude or times of silence or a Sabbath day to just rest and appreciate the totality and completeness of God. I'm not saying those things don't help you connect with God. Here's what I think John and other early followers of Jesus understood about our spiritual growth, that we in our modern context, especially we Americans, we miss this. The private disciplines we pursue are to support our love of one another, not replace it. The reason I read the Bible is not a substitute for doing what I learned from it. Praying "I'm sorry" to God does not replace an apology to someone I've hurt or done injustice to. Fasting and resting and taking some time alone is not a goal. These are tools. These are private practices that then empower us and enable us to do the primary action of the church, which we talked about last week, is to love one another. We don't practice reading the Bible just so we can get better at reading the Bible. I think it's great that you want to learn and study the Bible. I can point you to some great resources that will help you learn the historical context and literary context of the writings. I hope you'll dig in and go deep and learn as much as you can. But learning how to read the Bible is not the goal of reading the Bible. The same goes for prayer. Jesus didn't teach His disciples how to pray so they could get really good at prayer. A good prayer time is not the goal of your discipleship to Jesus. Will a vibrant prayer life help you? No doubt. But Jesus knew that the point of praying wasn't praying. The point of prayer was connection with God, to be in the presence of God. And by being in the presence of God, it changes you to be the kind of person who better reflects that image of God to the world through acts of love and generosity and kindness and gentleness and all the aspects of God's character that we all struggle to be. Any private discipline you practice isn't designed to be the end goal of your spiritual life. Private disciplines are a gift that help us remember who we are and who God is. They help us confront how far we still have to go in our love for others. Private disciplines give us an anchor point of grace and mercy when we don't get it right. But they are tools that lead us to change the way we treat others. Because the measure of a disciple, the measure of a follower of Jesus, is how we do at loving one another. However, it has become commonplace in our American individualistic culture to define our loyalty to Jesus by certain practices which don't really require us to pay any attention to the relationships with others at all. We get deceived into thinking we are getting closer to God all by ourselves because we attend a worship service or read a passage of the Bible every day or spend some extra time at each meal praying. So did you stop doing these things? Absolutely not. Are these good indicators of your spiritual growth? Maybe. If attending church helps you reflect and then practice what you just heard taught, if your prayer time helps you realize God's perfect love for you and that prompts you to love the people around you and serve them well, if reading the Bible reveals to you the provision and faithfulness of God that pushes you to give generously to others because you begin to realize all you have is God's anyway, then yes. But why do you think this piece of Paul's letter to the Corinthians is so popular? You hear it all times at weddings. Paul is writing to the church in Corinth and he's trying to help them stay unified. There's been factions forming and groups of people have begun to cause division over several issues, and Paul's writing with advice on how to handle several specific issues. But near the end of the letter, he begins to instruct them and remind them that the goal of their lives is to love one another. Let me read you this section of his letter because it's so powerful. It begins in the end of chapter 12. He says, "And now I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but I have not love, I am nothing. And if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames but I have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And he wraps up, you guys know this, he wraps up, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Listen, there is only one way to grow closer to God. You get better at loving other people, period. Everything else is directed at helping you become more like God in that way, in the way you love. Your church attendance, your Bible reading, your prayer time, your giving, your serving and volunteering, your joining a small group. The end goal is to produce in you love. And the only way for you to practice that is by committing your time and energy toward a group of people with the sole purpose of getting better at love. A lot of people join a group so they can learn more about the Bible. I think that's amazing. Bible study groups are awesome. But it's possible to study the Bible and learn a whole lot. But as Paul said, knowledge will pass away. I hope that the group that studies the Bible together will eventually begin to love each other in a way that reflects the love of God. And a lot of folks get involved serving because they want to feel like they belong or they want to feel valuable and a part of something. I think that's great. That's a good thing. I want people to get involved at our church and contribute But eventually, I hope that we'll all learn that the end goal of serving is to serve the other person and meet their needs with our gifts and abilities. Because as Paul said, I don't gain anything from giving away all I have and breaking my body for the poor just so I can boast about it. My service is not for me. Without love for the people I'm serving, I have nothing. In American culture, we have defined our spiritual growth by individualistic measurements rather than looking at spiritual growth as a group project. Do you remember group projects in school? I used to be an English teacher way back in the day, and I'd always fight with myself and my students about group projects because here's what I knew. Most of the time in a group, only one person is really going to do all the work and everyone else is just kind of going to go along for the ride. So as a teacher, my goal was to structure that group project in such a way as to require the individuals to need each other and help them work together to learn and then produce something. But most of the time, I had already given them the main concepts and information that they needed. In other words, the group project wasn't to learn more information. It was to use the information they had learned to bring the learning and perspective and abilities of all these individuals together in order to practice working and producing something together. That's what God has done for this project that Jesus called the church. The content is pretty straightforward. Love one another. But He's structured the group project in such a way that we need each other. In fact, it is impossible to enjoy a closeness to God without this group project. The more we try to make our faith an individual project, the farther from the end goal we get. But when we lean into this group project, when we make intentional connections, when we commit to relationships that encourage us and challenge us, when we make it a regular part of our life rhythm, we begin to truly grow. We begin to grow closer to God precisely because we begin to experience the kind of love we are designed to crave. And nobody in this world gets closer to God by isolating themselves and just spending time with God. Even the monks know they need a brotherhood. They live in community together and they do life together. We are better together because that's the way God put together this project. Life is a group project. So how are you going to get closer to God? Well, we've got some ways to help you. Are you wanting to try to find a group of people to do life with? If you live locally to our church, get registered for our Wednesday workshops coming up starting this week. September 7th is our first workshop. We've got a couples workshop, a men's workshop, and a women's workshop. They will all run from 7 to 8 p.m. on Wednesdays in September right here at the Force Center. And you'll get the chance to spend time in discussion with some other folks, getting to know them and practicing the first steps of finding a group of people to do life with. If not, make some intentional steps toward creating these types of relationships with people you already know. It may just be they're wanting the same kind of group project that you are. Listen, either way, you will not have the kind of relationship with God that you really want until you begin to commit your life to a group of people. That's where you'll get to practice the kind of love that reflects the love that Jesus modeled for us. And that will draw you closer to God.